The Journalism Awards dinner had just called our newsroom's name for the year's top investigative prize when Gregory Lang, my editor of 9 years, took the podium ahead of me, microphone already in hand, and told 200 journalists and publishers that the story we just won for contained a fabricated quote I'd invented to make our corruption piece land harder. I was standing near the edge of the stage in the blazer I'd bought specifically for this exact possibility, the award still sitting backstage waiting to be handed over, when his voice carried across the ballroom and every conversation at every table stopped at once. He said it with the measured reluctance of a man forced into an uncomfortable admission that he'd reviewed my source notes quietly for weeks after a tip from another reporter, that he respected my instincts as a journalist, but couldn't in good conscience accept an award built on a quote that didn't hold up to scrutiny. The publisher, Ms. Alvarez, seated at the head table, set down her fork slowly, her expression sliding from celebratory to something far more guarded. My research assistant, Nadia, seated 2 tables back with the rest of our small investigative team, went rigid, glancing at me like she wasn't sure whether to look shocked or defensive on my behalf. A rival editor near the front, someone whose paper we'd beaten out for this exact award, leaned toward his colleague and whispered something behind his hand, and I watched the ripple of that whisper move backward through the ballroom table by table until the whole room seemed to be holding its breath at once. A photographer hired for the event kept snapping photos out of habit, the flash catching Gregory mid-sentence, and somewhere near the bar, I could hear glasses clinking to a stop as the bartenders themselves paused to listen. I said Gregory's name once, quiet, the way you say a name when part of you still hopes the person will stop themselves before it becomes something neither of you can walk back. And he looked past me toward the room full of publishers instead of at me, like their opinion of him mattered more in that moment than the truth of what he'd just said. Nadia found me in the hallway just outside the ballroom a few minutes later, my award still sitting untouched backstage, and asked quietly if I was okay, her voice low enough that the catering staff moving past us wouldn't overhear. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that I was still trying to understand what had just happened in real time, the same as everyone else in that room. She said she'd transcribed most of the interview audio herself during the reporting process, and something about Gregory's version of events didn't sit right with what she remembered typing out months earlier. She offered, without my even asking, to pull her old transcription files that night in case it mattered later, and I found myself grateful in a way that surprised me, realizing how quickly people either quietly stepped closer or quietly stepped back once an accusation like that entered a room. Nadia texted me around 1 in the morning that same night, saying she'd found her old transcription draft from the interview, and something about it had been bothering her ever since she reread it. She said she remembered typing the quote exactly as it appeared in her draft, word for word matching what she'd heard on the audio at the time, and that the version that eventually ran in the published story read slightly differently than what she'd originally transcribed. She hadn't thought much of small differences back then, assuming Gregory had simply cleaned up a stray word during his final pass the way editors always did. But rereading her old file now, next to everything unfolding at the dinner, made the discrepancy feel far less minor than it had seemed at the time. She said she'd send me the file first thing in the morning so I could compare it against the raw audio myself. Gregory and I had worked together for nearly a decade, since he'd hired me straight out of a small regional paper nobody outside our home state had ever heard of. And for years, I believed he genuinely saw something in me worth developing. I remembered him staying past midnight with me the week before my first big investigative piece ran, going through every line of the draft with a red pen until the story finally felt bulletproof enough to publish. I remembered him personally vouching for me to the publisher when I was up for a promotion two other more senior reporters also wanted, telling her flatly that my instincts were sharper than reporters twice my experience. I remember the two of us splitting a 6-hour drive to track down a reluctant source for an earlier story, trading terrible gas station coffee and worse radio stations the whole way there, laughing about it for years afterward. I remembered him calling me the night my father passed, not saying much of anything useful, just staying on the phone until I finally stopped crying long enough to sleep. I remembered the night our contracting story finally cleared final legal review before publication. The two of us standing in the empty newsroom well past midnight, too exhausted to properly celebrate, just quietly proud of each other in a way that didn't need many words. None of that mattered on that stage, under those lights, with 200 journalists suddenly wondering whether the reporter they just applauded had actually fabricated evidence. The story itself, the one Gregory was now describing to a ballroom full of publishers, had taken nearly 8 months to report. A dense investigation into a city contracting scandal, built on dozens of interviews, thousands of pages of documents, and one particularly reluctant whistleblower who'd only agreed to talk after months of careful, patient outreach. I remember the specific tension of that final interview, conducted in a parked car 3 blocks from the source's office, because he was too nervous to meet anywhere more visible. And I remembered recording the entire conversation on my phone exactly the way I always did, a habit drilled into me by Gregory himself years earlier, after a different source once disputed something he swore he'd never said. What I hadn't fully registered until Gregory's accusation forced me to think back through every detail was a small edit Gregory had made to the final draft during his last editorial pass, tightening one particular quote for length in a way I trusted without double-checking against my own raw audio, since editors adjusted phrasing for clarity all the time and I'd never had a reason to distrust his judgment before. What Gregory didn't know, what only Nadia and my partner Sam knew, was that I still had the complete, unedited recording of that final interview saved exactly where I always saved my raw audio, backed up automatically to the newsroom's secure archive with a timestamp from the actual day of the interview, months before the piece ever went to print. I hadn't gone looking for the recording after the story published successfully, and the scandal it exposed led to 2 resignations at City Hall, since the fact-checking process had already cleared every quote before publication, the kind of routine verification that happens on every major investigative piece, without anyone thinking twice about it afterward. I only thought to pull the recording again once whispers of Gregory's version of events started circulating through the newsroom in the weeks leading up to the awards dinner, and I'd quietly requested a copy from the archive just in case, never imagining I'd actually need to use it in front of an audience. The night the dinner fell apart, my partner Sam sat with me at our kitchen table, going through every detail of that interview we could both remember, cross-referencing my old reporting notes against the newsroom's fact-checking file, to make sure my memory of what happened matched what the recording would actually show once I got my hands on it. He kept a legal pad open beside him, jotting down a rough timeline of every editorial pass the story had gone through, occasionally reading a line back to me to see if it matched what I remembered from the actual reporting process. At one point, Sam asked, carefully, whether I thought Gregory genuinely believed the version of events he'd described on stage, that maybe stress or professional jealousy had reshaped his memory of the editing process into something that let him feel less responsible for the change he'd made. I told him it didn't matter what Gregory had convinced himself of, because the recording didn't have a memory that bent under pressure. It simply captured what the source actually said, and I intended to let it speak for itself the moment I had the chance. Sam finally set the pad down around 2 in the morning, reached across the table, and told me that whatever the review decided, the recording wasn't going to change no matter how many times Gregory told the story differently. 3 days before the newsroom's internal ethics review convened, an email arrived from a former colleague named Priya, someone who'd worked alongside Gregory on a different investigation years earlier, before leaving journalism entirely for a corporate communications job. She said she'd heard through a mutual friend what had happened at the awards dinner and wanted to share something that had bothered her for a long time, unsure whether it was her place to say anything since she no longer worked in the industry. She said that during her own time reporting with Gregory, she'd once caught him tightening a source's quote in a way that shifted its meaning slightly. And when she'd flagged it, he told her privately that a little polish never hurt a story as long as the overall point stayed true, a philosophy she'd quietly disagreed with, but never formally reported since nothing had blown up publicly at the time. She said she'd carried that memory around for years without quite knowing what to do with it, telling herself it wasn't her place to raise something years old that hadn't caused visible harm, and had nearly let it fade entirely until the news reached her through an old coworker's message. She said hearing about the accusation against me made her wonder if that same quiet habit had finally caught up with him in a way he couldn't control this time. She said if it would help, she was willing to put that account in writing for the ethics review. The ethics review meeting was tense from the moment everyone sat down, Ms. Alvarez present alongside 2 outside journalism ethics consultants brought in specifically because of how publicly the accusation had unfolded. Gregory repeated his claim, calmer now, more rehearsed, describing the disputed quote in language that placed the fabrication entirely on my reporting, rather than his own editing choices. I let him finish completely before saying anything, because I wanted the review to hear his full account before I set the actual recording beside it. Then I played the unedited audio for the room, time-stamped and unaltered straight from the newsroom's secure archive, the source's actual voice saying almost exactly what had run in print, except for the one specific phrase Gregory had tightened during his final pass, a phrase that in the original recording carried a slightly different meaning than the version that had ultimately run. Gregory said editing for clarity happened on every story, that minor phrasing adjustments were standard practice. And for a moment, one of the outside consultants looked briefly sympathetic to that argument, since editorial tightening genuinely does happen on nearly every piece without controversy. One of the consultants asked to hear the exact wording side by side, the printed version against the transcript of the raw audio, and even reading them aloud in sequence. The gap between what the source had actually said and what had ultimately run in print was small but unmistakable. A shift subtle enough to survive casual scrutiny, but sharp enough to change the sentence's implication in a way that mattered. Nadia's original transcription draft, submitted separately that morning, matched the raw audio exactly, word for word, further confirming that the discrepancy had been introduced sometime after her initial transcript and before the story went to print, narrowing the window of responsibility down to Gregory's own final editorial pass. That was when Priya's written statement was read aloud to the review, describing Gregory's own past habit of quietly tightening quotes in ways that shifted their meaning while defending it as harmless polish. The room went completely still, except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Gregory's expression shifted the way a person's does when they realize a private habit they assumed nobody had ever noticed has just resurfaced in front of the only people whose judgment could actually affect his career. He said the statement was secondhand, unverifiable, taken out of context from a private conversation years earlier. But Ms. Alvarez asked flatly whether he denied ever saying anything like that to a colleague, and Gregory didn't answer the question directly at all. One of the outside consultants asked quietly whether this meant the pattern described might extend to other stories across Gregory's long editing career that had never been closely reviewed. And Ms. Alvarez said that given what had just been heard, the newsroom would need to open a broader retrospective review of his editorial history going back several years. Gregory gathered his folder without another word and left the room, and nobody moved to stop him. The fallout moved through the newsroom slowly but completely over the following months. The publisher placed Gregory on unpaid leave, pending the full retrospective review, and within the quarter, he resigned, rather than continue working under the scrutiny that review had created. Two other reporters who had worked under him years earlier came forward separately once word spread, describing similar concerns about quietly tightened quotes that had never been formally challenged at the time. A journalism school that had booked him to guest lecture on investigative ethics that spring quietly canceled the appearance without much public explanation, the kind of change everyone in the industry understood exactly how to read. A press freedom organization that had shortlisted him for a mid-career recognition award quietly pulled his name from consideration a week later, citing an internal review of eligibility that nobody pressed them to explain further. Even so, a handful of longtime colleagues who'd always respected Gregory professionally struggled to fully reconcile the version of him described in the review with the demanding, meticulous editor they'd known for years. And I understood that some professional loyalty, once built over a decade of shared deadlines and shared bylines, doesn't fully disappear just because the truth comes out clearly. Gregory reached out to me by email nearly 2 months later, saying he was sorry, that years of quietly tightening quotes without consequence had convinced him somewhere along the way that his instincts for a cleaner sentence mattered more than the exact words a source had actually used, and that he'd never truly examined how dangerous that quiet habit had become, until it finally caught up with him in front of people whose judgment he couldn't control. He wrote that he'd started meeting with a career counselor for the first time since journalism school, something he said he'd have found almost laughable a year earlier, and that being forced to explain his choices out loud to someone with no stake in the outcome had been the first thing that made the shame feel survivable rather than something to keep hiding from. He said he genuinely believed, in some distorted way he couldn't fully explain even to himself, that accusing me first at the dinner would protect the career he'd built, and that he understood now how badly that instinct had cost both of us, far more than either of us could have predicted walking into that ballroom. I read the email twice and didn't respond right away. When I finally did, I told him I appreciated the honesty, that I didn't fully understand the choice he'd made, and that I hoped whatever came next for him involved genuinely examining it rather than simply disappearing quietly the way his resignation had let him do. The unexpected part came the following year, when Ms. Alvarez privately suggested that given how publicly the dispute had unfolded, taking the newsroom's senior investigative editor position I'd been quietly considered for would likely go smoother if I built my leadership case somewhat separately from the story that had made me publicly known throughout the industry, at least for a while, rather than having every future decision quietly measured against the awards dinner story. It wasn't the outcome I wanted. Watching a story I'd spent 8 months carefully reporting become the thing my name got attached to industry-wide, instead of the years of careful, unremarkable work that actually defined my career. But within the year, I accepted the position anyway, built my leadership case on new stories entirely, and Sam sat beside me the night I was formally announced as senior investigative editor, squeezing my hand the way he had through every hard year leading up to it, Nadia raising a glass across the table, with a grin that told me she still remembered exactly how we'd gotten there. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the version of this story where Gregory never said anything at that dinner, where the two of us kept working side by side the way we always had, still trading terrible gas station coffee on long reporting trips, the way we did when I was still new enough to need his patience. And I remind myself that proving the truth cost me a decade-long mentorship, but staying quiet would have cost me my own byline instead. If you've ever had someone who shaped your career try to save themselves by rewriting what actually happened, you know that winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like finally being able to stand on solid ground again. If this story hit home for you, hit like and subscribe, because there's another one coming next week.